Hello everyone and welcome back. It's good to see so many returning viewers, and for those of you who are joining us for the first time, thank you for tuning in. Here at True Crime Chronicles, we bring you deeply researched accounts of criminal cases from around the world, every single day. If you haven't already, please consider hitting that subscribe button so you never miss a new episode. Now that the housekeeping is out of the way, let's ease into today's story. This case takes us back to Newark, New Jersey, in the fall of 2014. It's a chilling account of trust betrayed, a horrifying crime hidden behind the facade of a loving partnership. The victim, a caring and compassionate woman named Olga de Jesus, never suspected that her life would be cut short by the very person who had promised to cherish and protect her, her fiancé, Lamont Stevenson. Today we'll delve deep into this case, examining who Olga was, the events leading up to her tragic end, the harrowing discovery, the subsequent investigation, and the enduring impact on her family and community. So, let's begin. It is October 17, 2014, late evening, in the city of Newark. The clock reads just after 9:45 p.m., and a steady drizzle falls beneath the glow of the old street lamps. The pavement is slick, reflecting distorted halos of neon and headlights. There's a quiet hush over the block where Olga and Lamont share an apartment, a row of three-story homes with faded paint and chain-link fences. Neighbors settling in for the night might hear the distant hum of traffic along nearby Broad Street, but the immediate neighborhood rests in relative calm. Inside Olga's apartment, the air feels heavier than usual, as if anticipating something unspeakable. The space is modest, a small living room with a worn sofa, family photographs arranged carefully on side tables, a kitchen where pots and pans hang neatly, and a bedroom where books line a shelf near the bed. Outside the window, the drizzle intensifies, cars whoosh along the wet roads, and occasionally a siren wails in the distance, echoing through alleys and vacant lots. Tonight, Olga's presence is usually felt in her home. She is known for preferring warmth and comfort. Scented candles flicker on the coffee table, their faint cinnamon aroma blending with the smell of dinner leftovers. Ordinarily, Olga would be making plans for the weekend, chatting with friends over the phone, or drafting a lesson plan for the children she mentors. But at this moment, something is dreadfully wrong. The silence within these walls is not peaceful, it's charged, ominous, as though the apartment itself holds its breath. Earlier that day, Olga had gone about her daily routine. She woke at 7 a.m., greeted by a crisp, overcast autumn sky. Slipping into her favorite wool cardigan, she took a moment on the back stoop, sipping her coffee and watching damp leaves flutter onto the concrete. By 8 a.m., she was out of the apartment, heading to her job at a nearby youth center, where she helped guide local teenagers toward positive paths. Witnesses recall her smiling on the sidewalk, nodding good morning to a neighbor walking their dog. At 8:30 a.m., she arrived at the center, signed in at the front desk, and spent the morning assisting students with their college applications. Co-workers remember her positive energy that day. She spoke of a planned dinner at home, a quiet night with Lamont, something she looked forward to after a long work week. By midday, she took her lunch break at a corner deli, chatting briefly with the owner, who knew her by name. After 1 p.m., she returned to the center, reviewing program materials, making calls to potential guest speakers, and finalizing a small workshop for the following week. Around 5:30 p.m., Olga left the youth center, her figure captured on security footage as she stepped onto the street, a soft scarf wrapped around her neck, her purse clutched close. Neighbors saw her arrive home shortly after 6 p.m., keys jangling as she pushed open the front gate. Another resident of the building thinks they heard her voice around 7 p.m., possibly speaking to Lamont or on the phone. At some point between then and nightfall, the warmth and routine of Olga's world would take a dark turn. When concerns first arose, it began subtly. Olga's friend Marisol had expected a call around 9 p.m. They often chatted every Friday evening to recap the week. As the clock approached 9:30 p.m. with no call, Marisol grew uneasy. She dialed Olga's number and got no answer. Another call at 9:45 p.m. also went unanswered. This was out of character. Olga was known for her reliability, especially with friends. By 10:15 p.m., Marisol decided to check online messaging apps. Olga's last seen status was several hours old. Marisol texted a mutual friend who lived nearby. Moments later, this friend was tapping at Olga's front door, hearing nothing inside, just silence. She tried calling through the mail slot. No movement. Alarmed, they reached out to the property manager who, after some hesitation, contacted the local police. The first officers arrived on the scene close to 11 p.m. They knocked, announced themselves. No response. With a rising sense of dread, they gained entry. The officers moved through the home carefully. When they found Olga, there was no question something terrible had occurred. The police wanted them to examine the floor, but they were too scared. Something terrible had occurred. They immediately radioed for backup, medical assistance, and crime scene units. Neighbors, now alerted by flashing lights, peered anxiously through curtains. Word spread quickly along the block, and soon whispers of tragedy drifted through the autumn air. Before we delve deeper into the horrific discovery, let's take a step back and learn about Olga herself. Understanding who she was and what shaped her life might help us grasp the enormity of this loss. Olga's story begins decades before that fateful evening in 2014. Born in 1981 in a tight-knit community in Newark's North Ward, she grew up in a modest two-bedroom apartment, the youngest of 3 children. Her parents, both immigrants from Puerto Rico, instilled in their children values of hard work, empathy, and resilience. Olga's father worked long hours at a local bakery, his hands always slightly dusted with flour. Her mother was a homemaker who occasionally took sewing jobs. Together, they ensured their children understood the importance of education and community. As a child, Olga was known for her kind eyes and quiet determination. She was that kid who offered half her sandwich to another student if they forgot theirs, who stayed behind in class to help a classmate understand math problems. Her teachers recalled that she had a steady presence, never seeking the limelight but always supporting others. At home, her siblings remember her as the family peacemaker, smoothing over petty arguments and creating harmony. Even in her adolescence, while some teens drifted into rebellious phases, Olga stayed grounded, mindful of her parents' sacrifices." End quote. Her childhood was not without challenges. The neighborhood had its share of socio-economic struggles and the lingering shadows of crime, but Olga's family provided stability and love. Summers were filled with family picnics at Branch Brook Park, where she chased her cousins around flowering cherry trees. Winters meant huddling together in their apartment, telling stories and dreaming of brighter futures. From these experiences, Olga learned empathy, patience, and the power of giving back. Following high school, Olga pursued an associate's degree at a local community college, balancing coursework with part-time jobs. She briefly considered nursing but found her calling in youth mentorship and community development. Growing up in Newark, she saw the pain of poverty and limited opportunities firsthand, and this guided her decision to work with youth programs. This route allowed her to combine her nurturing nature with her desire to inspire others. As the years passed, Olga continued to invest in her education, eventually completing a bachelor's degree in social work from a nearby state university. Family members beamed with pride at her graduation, recalling how the shy girl they once knew now stood confidently, diploma in hand. Professionally, Olga found purpose as a program coordinator at a local youth center. There, she partnered with schools, community leaders, and local businesses to provide resources for teenagers who risked being left behind. She guided them through scholarship applications, organized workshops on life skills, and connected them with mentors. She dreamed of expanding these programs, perhaps one day establishing her own nonprofit aimed at bridging educational gaps in urban communities. Colleagues admired her dedication and often commented that Olga's presence in the center's hallways seemed to calm anxious students. She had a vision: to see Newark's next generation rise above the challenges they faced. To support her aspirations, Olga networked tirelessly. She established professional relationships with teachers, social workers, and police officers who were engaged in community outreach. She worked closely with local educational initiatives, attended seminars, and even considered applying for a master's degree program. Her ambition was never about personal gain. Instead, it was driven by a quiet resolve to repay the kindness and opportunities she had received by giving them to others. Family remained central in Olga's life. She visited her parents weekly, helping her mother with groceries, listening patiently to her father's stories about his bakery's new recipes. She remained close to her siblings, both of whom had started their own families. Olga was the adored aunt, always remembering birthdays with thoughtful gifts. In recent years, with both parents nearing retirement age, Olga had stepped in to manage their healthcare appointments and ensure they were comfortable. Family gatherings were filled with laughter, home-cooked meals, and late-night board games. Her relatives recall how, even in adulthood, Olga had not lost her childhood warmth. She'd hold her mother's hand during challenging times and make sure everyone felt valued, seen, and loved. Beyond her family ties, Olga was also integrated into a supportive circle of friends. Some friendships dated back to elementary school, while others formed through community volunteering and professional partnerships. On weekends, she enjoyed coffee meetups at small cafes, movie nights, and Sunday brunches where everyone updated each other on life's changes. Her interests were varied. She loved reading biographies of social activists, listening to smooth jazz, and taking long walks along the Passaic River, especially during the fall when the leaves turned vibrant hues. She had a habit of jotting down motivational quotes in a small notebook, sometimes sharing these uplifting phrases with friends who faced hardships. These interests and relationships painted the portrait of a woman whose life was centered on hope, empathy, and future possibilities. She nurtured her students, supported her family, and remained engaged in her community. Those who knew her describe her as a quiet force, unassuming, yet profoundly impactful. It was in this stable environment of love and support that Olga eventually crossed paths with Lamont Stevenson. In the final weeks leading up to the incident, Olga's family noted no unusual tension. They believed Lamont was a kind, steady presence in her life. The couple had announced their engagement months earlier, toasting with cheap champagne and smiling brightly in photographs. There were no outward signs of conflict that raised alarms among relatives. Her siblings, parents, and closest friends all say she seemed content, excited even, about her future as part of a committed partnership. If there were undercurrents of tension or secrets, Olga confided in no one. Or perhaps she didn't fully recognize the warning signs herself. The day of the murder, October 17, 2014, began like most others. By 6:30 a.m., Olga stirred, the room lit faintly by a gray dawn peeking through sheer curtains. Outside it was unseasonably cool and damp. She stepped into the kitchen wearing plush slippers and set a kettle to boil. The aroma of fresh coffee soon seeping from the parlor. Hennon read to a local newspaper several hundred miles away. She moved quietly, not wanting to wake Lamont, who was still sleeping. Olga took a moment to review notes for the youth center's afternoon session. She considered making French toast for breakfast, but time pressed her forward. She needed to leave by 8 a.m. At around 7:15 a.m., Olga gently woke Lamont. A neighbor, who occasionally glimpsed into their window while passing by, recalls seeing Olga standing in her robe near the kitchen sink around that time. An hour later, Olga grabbed her purse, stepped onto the stoop, and headed to work. She stopped to straighten a welcome mat that had slipped off center. The morning air smelled faintly of damp leaves and distant car exhaust. Everything seemed normal. Her parting words to Lamont, according to text messages later recovered, were about meeting for dinner that evening. By mid-morning, Olga was immersed in her work at the youth center. She signed off on a student mentoring proposal, emailed a local charity for potential collaboration, and facilitated a short morning meeting with her colleagues at 10 a.m. The weather outside remained dreary, overcast skies, intermittent drizzle, yet inside the center Olga's presence brightened the atmosphere. Around noon, she grabbed a quick lunch, an apple and a turkey sandwich, chatting briefly with a student who asked her advice about college majors. A coworker passing by her office at around 1:15 p.m. noted Olga's concentrated expression as she typed up notes from the morning meeting. There was no indication of anything unusual. In fact, Olga was humming softly, a habit she had when she felt productive and satisfied. From 2 p.m. to 5 p.m., Olga engaged in her usual tasks, drafting a workshop curriculum, following up with parents of prospective mentees, and coordinating with a local scholarship fund. She made a few calls on her personal cell phone, one to her brother to confirm Sunday dinner plans, another to an old friend who was going through a tough time. Both calls ended positively. At 5:25 p.m., building security cameras recorded Olga leaving the youth center. She wore a long beige coat over her work attire and carried a worn leather purse. The footage shows her pausing to exchange a few words with the security guard before stepping into the drizzle. Between 5:30 p.m. and 6 p.m., Olga's path home is traced by a combination of CCTV from local businesses and a neighbor's testimony. She stopped briefly at a corner store to pick up some groceries, milk, bread, and a small bouquet of daisies. The store's cashier remembered her friendly nod and a gentle, "Have a nice evening," as she exited. At approximately 6:10 p.m., Olga was seen entering the front gate of her apartment building. A neighbor saw her fumble briefly with her keys, balancing groceries and an umbrella before disappearing inside. That was the last confirmed sighting of Olga alive. In the hours that followed, witnesses around the building recall faint sounds, muffled voices, a raised tone perhaps, but nothing that signaled immediate danger. There were no obvious screams or alarms. The weather worsened slightly, heavier rain tapping at windows, perhaps masking any unusual noises. Surveillance footage from the building's foyer recorded Lamont Stevenson leaving the premises around 8:30 p.m. He walked briskly, head down, hood pulled up, blending with the misty darkness. He did not appear distressed, but his departure would later raise many questions. By 9 p.m., Olga's friend Marisol tried to reach her. With no response and the clock ticking onward, concern mounted. At approximately 10:30 p.m., a worried acquaintance knocked on Olga's door. No answer. Calls to Olga's phone went straight to voicemail. With alarm levels rising, a decision was made to notify the authorities. The police, familiar with the neighborhood's complex dynamic, arrived at around 11 p.m. and forced entry when no one responded to their announcements. Inside, in the dim light of flashlights and the hum of distant sirens, officers discovered Olga's lifeless body. The room was oddly still. It looked as if she had been preparing a meal, ingredients on the counter, a table half set. A sense of dread washed over everyone present. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery, the Newark police initiated standard first response procedures. Officers secured the scene, marking off the hallway with yellow crime scene tape. Detectives arrived shortly after midnight, their suit jackets turning dark with rain as they hurried from patrol cars to the apartment entry. Paramedics confirmed what was already evident. Olga had no signs of life. The initial suspicion, given the circumstances, was homicide. With a victim found inside her own home, no forced entry beyond police intervention, and an absent fiancé, the gravity of the situation crystallized swiftly. An urgent search for Lamont Stevenson commenced before dawn. Evidence technicians began their meticulous process. They photographed the apartment from every angle, collected samples of fibers, dusted surfaces for fingerprints, and carefully bagged the daisies that Olga had carried home just hours earlier. The crime scene was methodically documented, each measurement and observation recorded. Detective Sergeant Maria Hernandez later reported in official documents that the scene bore no signs of a chaotic struggle. This suggested the attacker might have been someone the victim trusted. Early interviews conducted that night with neighbors yielded little. Most had heard nothing distinctive, only normal apartment sounds, and the persistent hush of rain. By 2 a.m., investigators accessed Olga's phone records and examined her laptop for any clues. Emails, texts, and calendar entries painted a portrait of an ordinary, productive day. No arguments logged, no frantic calls for help. Their minds turned to Lamont. Where had he gone? Was he a victim as well? Or was he a suspect? As the hours passed, the urgency mounted. The next morning, as word of Olga's death spread, local media picked up the story. Early Saturday news segments showed a quiet residential street lined with police cars. By noon, reporters with handheld microphones stood behind barriers, relaying the few known facts. A woman found dead, circumstances unclear. They showed an old photograph of Olga, smiling softly, an image provided by a friend. Across television screens, online forums, and social media feeds, speculation simmered. Was it a robbery gone wrong? A domestic dispute turned fatal? The community wanted answers, and the police urged patience. In the following days, Olga's family, reeling from shock and grief, made emotional appeals through the media. Her mother pleaded, voice cracking, for anyone with information to come forward. Her siblings described Olga's devotion to the neighborhood's youth, hoping that honoring her memory would encourage the public to assist. The community, too, felt the weight of the loss. Neighbors left flowers and candles at her doorstep. Her colleagues at the youth center organized a vigil, where students wrote notes about how Olga had changed their lives. The sadness was palpable, and so was the growing call for justice. As the investigation gained momentum, detectives worked tirelessly. They analyzed digital footprints, pulling phone records, email exchanges, and social media communications. They interviewed Olga's co-workers, family members, and neighbors. Most recalled seeing Lamont and Olga as a quiet couple, without overt conflicts. Some described Lamont as reserved, polite, but not overly social. Investigators mapped out Lamont's background, combed through his employment records, and looked into his past relationships. They wanted to find that critical piece of evidence that would link him to the crime, or exonerate him altogether. The media coverage intensified. Local stations replayed interviews with neighbors who expressed shock. They focused on Olga's community work, painting a portrait of a life cut tragically short. This ongoing coverage pressured the police department and city officials to devote all possible resources to the case. The public demanded that whoever took Olga's life be brought to justice. With each passing day, the absence of Lamont Stevenson grew more suspicious. Under this pressure, the case advanced. Technicians discovered partial fingerprints on a kitchen cabinet and on the door latch. Forensic analysts worked around the clock, and digital experts recovered an incomplete text draft on Olga's phone. They also examined surveillance footage from nearby intersections, searching for Lamont's distinctive hooded figure. A flurry of interviews with Lamont's acquaintances painted a murkier picture of his past than Olga's family had imagined. Friends who initially vouched for his character now hesitated, recalling odd comments he made months before, or strange disappearances for days at a time. As the media continued to cover the story, public sentiment grew increasingly uneasy. Olga's death rattled the community, reminding everyone of the fragility of trust and safety. Her family's appeals for help struck a chord, prompting local activists to organize a neighborhood watch initiative. People lit candles, shared her story on social media, and wrote letters to elected officials demanding more robust domestic violence prevention programs. The shock and sorrow began to crystallize into action. Olga's death would not be in vain. Within a week, the police announced a significant breakthrough. Fingerprints collected at the scene, and a careful review of digital evidence tied Lamont Stevenson to the apartment at the exact time frame of the murder. Police obtained an arrest warrant, and soon after, Lamont's name and face were broadcast widely. Images of him, previously a shadowy figure in Olga's narrative, were now front and center. The reports indicated he had a previous brush with the law. Minor offenses, not enough to predict homicide, but enough to warrant scrutiny. Tips started trickling in from the public. Someone thought they saw him near a bus terminal. Another claimed he might have fled state lines. "You are absent from state lives." A period of days. As the investigation deepened, the digital trail and interviews with Lamont's past associates revealed a troubled background. He had a history of failed relationships and short-term jobs. Former coworkers described him as reserved, sometimes moody, and quick to leave when conflicts arose. He had never appeared violent outwardly, but there were anecdotes of controlling behavior, mild at the time but chilling in hindsight. Investigators studied his psychology. Profilers suggested he might have felt threatened by Olga's successes or intimidated by her strong family bonds and community presence. Days turned into weeks, and the search for Lamont expanded. The FBI joined local and state authorities, circulating wanted posters and conducting interviews far beyond Newark. Technology helped narrow down his whereabouts. An old cell phone ping, a hotel CCTV snapshot, or a rental car receipt. Forensic accountants followed his financial tracks. Meanwhile, Olga's family watched the developments with mingled hope and heartbreak, wanting answers, desperate for closure. Overcoming jurisdictional hurdles and limited manpower, the team persisted. Expert consultations offered fresh angles. They analyzed behavioral patterns. An unreturned rental car, a string of odd purchases. All these fragments formed a portrait of a fleeing suspect who knew he had crossed a line that could never be undone. The community, still reeling, volunteered to plaster wanted posters in shops and bus stops. The city collectively held its breath, waiting for news of an arrest. When Lamont Stevenson was finally apprehended years later, it was due to the tireless efforts of law enforcement and a critical tip from a bystander who recognized him from news reports. He had been living under the radar, taking odd jobs and keeping a low profile. The tension that had hovered over the city began to dissipate. At last the suspect would face justice. As the legal proceedings commenced, the wheels of justice turned methodically. Officers transported Lamont Stevenson back to Newark to face charges. Under heavy scrutiny, he was booked at the local jail, fingerprinted, and photographed. The initial hearings were brief and procedural, setting the stage for a trial that would draw significant attention. Olga's family watched from the courthouse gallery, eyes red from tears, determined to see this through. During the trial, prosecutors laid out a meticulous narrative of evidence. They presented the timeline, phone records, and physical evidence gathered at the scene. They introduced expert witnesses, crime scene analysts, forensic psychologists, and digital forensic specialists, each piece inching closer to revealing a clear picture of what happened that night. The defense attempted to challenge the evidence, suggesting alternate theories and raising questions about the chain of custody or witness reliability. But the prosecution's case was strong. Witnesses took the stand. Olga's friends and family described her kindness, her dedication to others, painting a portrait of a life stolen too soon. Investigators explained how the absence of forced entry and the fingerprint matches pointed to Lamont. Surveillance footage linked him to the scene around the time of the crime. Digital traces, half-finished text messages, and suspicious internet searches further tightened the noose. Court proceedings stretched for days, each detail weighed and measured. The judge maintained a sober atmosphere, reminding jurors of their duty to remain impartial. In closing arguments, the prosecution emphasized that this was a crime of betrayal, not a random act of violence. The defense tried one last time to sow doubt, but the evidence was overwhelming. When the jury returned with a guilty verdict, the courtroom fell silent. Then, quiet sobs emerged from Olga's family. A subtle gasp echoed through the gallery. Justice had been served, though the void left by Olga's absence could never be filled. In sentencing, the judge acknowledged the profound loss suffered by the victim's loved ones. Lamont Stevenson received a lengthy prison term, ensuring he would not harm another innocent soul. Impact statements, delivered by Olga's family, left many in tears, detailing the heartbreak, the sleepless nights, the future family gatherings that would feel painfully incomplete. In the months that followed the trial, Olga's family faced the grueling task of healing. They confronted the empty seat at the dinner table, her unoccupied childhood bedroom in her parents' home, and the unreturned text messages still lingering on their phones. They leaned on each other and on therapy, slowly learning to cope with their new reality. Support from the community helped. Neighbors offered meals, friends organized memorial services, and local organizations established a scholarship fund in Olga's name to help young people, just as she had done in life. The community felt the impact as well. Olga's work at the youth center had touched countless lives. In her memory, the center named a reading room after her, painting a mural that captured her nurturing spirit. Residents started programs aimed at preventing domestic violence, spreading awareness of the subtle signs that might precede tragedy. Candlelight vigils brought people together, not only to mourn Olga, but also to reaffirm their commitment to safeguarding each other. Over time, changes emerged at the policy level. Olga's murder prompted legislators to consider stronger protective measures for individuals in domestic partnerships. Awareness campaigns were launched to teach bystanders and community members to recognize warning signs and speak up. Police-community relations improved as well. Officers began holding workshops at local schools and youth centers, bridging gaps and fostering trust. The city did not forget Olga's legacy. Her story became a lesson in vigilance, compassion, and the importance of community solidarity. Years later, her family continued to remember Olga not just as a victim, but as the warm, giving soul who had dedicated her life to others. They cherished old photographs and handwritten notes she left behind. They visited her memorial at the youth center, where students still read her favorite quotes. And in quiet moments, they reflected on how her legacy lived on, through scholarships, community programs, and the lasting lessons her life and death imparted. Ultimately, this tragic crime left a permanent mark on those who knew Olga and those who learned of her story. It underscored the necessity of vigilance and the invaluable role of community support. Although justice was achieved, the cost was immeasurable. Lives were forever altered, dreams extinguished, and hearts left with an ache that would never fully fade. As we close this chapter, let's remember Olga for the joy and hope she brought to others. May her story remind us of the importance of looking out for one another, of speaking up when something feels wrong, and of never taking for granted the lives that intersect with ours. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime stories, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this case or suggestions for future episodes. Perhaps consider exploring other cases where community intervention and awareness played a crucial role in preventing further tragedy. Let's continue the conversation and honor Olga's memory by staying informed, engaged, and compassionate.